Hey, John.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. How about you?
Pretty good, pretty good. Sorry, one sec.
Sorry, just get my ducks in a row here.
Yeah, sure.
We'll miss. Just got a text from Rachel. She won't make it today. Something came up for her.
Oh, yeah, I'm seeing that.
So, how things with the roses?
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been cooking some pretty good food recently, so that's been fun.
Good. Tell me what.
Still just everything with the sous vide. It really is a lot of fun to use.
Yeah.
So simple. Just when Michael's in town, we went up to Lowry's and got a bunch of chicken and steak. So we're still working our way through that. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. Trying to get the sear perfect after you finish. Because with the sous vide, all that does is cook the meat all the way through. It comes out looking kind of gross. Like the outside, it doesn't get cooked at all.
Right.
So after you finish, you sear it, and it's pretty hard to do it well or to do it perfectly. So I've been just trying to get better at that recently.
Nice. I remember JP chewing on that some time back.
Yeah, the searing, getting a good sear on a steak is super rewarding. It just adds like so much more flavor.
Yeah. It does. And what I have no feel for, would have to get a feel for, is how moisturizing happens. I mean, I know a little bit about what not to do on a grill, and how to time your temperatures and your searing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know much about it, but put it this way, I've got some very basic idea that doesn't let me down too far, which is far from a studied craft, but I'm pretty sure I learned it from your dad, actually. Back in the day. No surprise. But I don't have a feel for what that's like. It sounds like you probably don't have the same sort of problem of driving your moisture out when you're cooking it in a sous vide.
Yeah, not really. Because you just finish cooking it, and then you take it off, and you just put it down on some paper towels and like really, really dry it off. And that makes it significantly easier.
Got it.
Yeah. And I love it because I can always do it on the cast iron, so don't ever need to go outside to grill if it's raining or something. But.
Right. So no idea when we'll get JP at 8 minutes after. We may or may not get him. Before we dive in, I do actually have something to work through, and I think we could dive in and just press on, if you're up for that.
Sure.
But what you've been listening to in the meantime, what you've been seeing?
I was reading part of that Caitlin Johnson article, which was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about the new ways that America is waging war. It's kind of sounded like, or at least that's how that one person was talking about it. How we do it mostly economically and by like a python instead of a tiger was the analogy, which just seemed as similar to how John was describing things. So that's cool. And then still just listening to the same stuff I always do, mostly just the daily. I pretty much listen to the daily every single day. That's definitely my most listened to podcast. But
I gotta give that a listen. I'm not sure I ever have, or if I have, it's because someone pointed me to one episode sometime or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Not on my list, so I'll add it.
Yeah, they just they do a pretty good job at getting at the big news story of every day. So, and a pretty honest job. And then there is a shorter or more of a series rather than like a news podcast called Nice White Parents, which is about basically modern integration in the New York school system. and the trials and tribulations that go along with that, both from the side of the poor Black community that was basically already at a school, and then all of these like rich white parents come to the school and kind of like gentrify it basically. So it's an interesting perspective. I don't know if I agree with all the takes, but it's certainly an interesting dive into the complexities of race relations in the U.S. So I've listened to a couple episodes of that, and it's been pretty cool, pretty interesting.
Good. I'll see if I can get some time for that. That sounds very interesting. Very much.
So yourself?
I had a couple of things. Let's see. I've been listening to. Well, I don't miss much that Lex Friedman puts out. And recently he had a guest, Eagleman. What is Eagleman's first name? Maybe it's Thomas Eagleman. In any case, he is a neuroscientist who's written a book called Live Wired, I think, is the title of it. And he laid out the fundamentals in that podcast episode. The idea is that there are so many different dimensions of your brain that are, he drew an analogy with cities, levels of pace, I think, except he might have used a different name for pace, but it more or less amounted to the same thing. In a city, you can imagine things that change slow and things change fast, right? And everything in between, very fast and very slow, the slowest and the fastest. And he says that, and there are urban analyses, city planning sort of analyses that take into account all of that. And he didn't do much with this. I could imagine that there's more to it, but I'm going to resist for a moment because he was only drawing an analogy. And he's saying that the brain is like that, and that there are developmental aspects of the brain. Here, the general phrase in mind that comes to mind here is neuroplasticity, but the plastic analogy is an old one. I think
that was where that was coming to my head, but
right. I think he pinned it on William James, actually. So that goes back. I don't know if that's 100 years or what that is, but JP, let me pause just for a second and rejoin you in a minute, if I could.
Sure.
Oh, sorry, John. JP, sorry, man.
Yeah, no problem.
Yep. So sorry about that. Back. That was it's my wife calling, and she knows I'm in the middle of this thing. So I figured she either butt dialed me or really needed me. I think it was Forma. We'll see. Anyway, that was very interesting. Constantly looking for more applicable, updated, powerful models of the brain and of intelligence, the way intelligence operates in the brain. So I've been enjoying a number of podcasts lately where folks are describing all of those things. and this guy this guy's model is very nice, without pretending to know all of the let me call it the biochemistry of a lot of these activities, and or the neuroscience behind them. I mean, you and I both know a tiny bit. We know what synapses are, for example. We know there's chemical transmission across synapses. We know there's electrical transmission down cell bodies, neurons, and et cetera, things like that. He takes that kind of structure and breaks it down into a bit more detail, still pretty public. But he's describing, what I mean by public is not deep into the neuroscience weeds, but in a way that that you can more or less understand if you've, with just an occasional dive into the details, as opposed to the kind of mastery that that neuroscientists would have. And this sort of seething, interactive, I'm going to make up a bunch of words here. I need some more. I mean, he's grabbing new ones too. Live wired is his, right? So it's responsive. It's responsive in different frequencies. That's another analogy to pacing. On different time scales. And the whole of it is sort of reaching out and morphing constantly at what we perceive as a structural level. And those structures, they change at one set of frequencies and they process information at another set of frequencies, and maybe lots of other sets of frequencies. From what I have heard, there may be more than one way to propagate information through everything from pressure waves that can work their way through, to chemical waves that can work their way through, to electrical waves that can work their way through, just to take three, right? And then if you know anything about Fourier transforms, which are basically everything's a sine wave, or a combination of sine waves in and out of phase in different frequencies, different amplitudes, etc. All of that, and you can build any combination of signal from a combination of waves. That's what a Fourier transform is. And these days it means press a button and up comes a map. Frequencies, and it's a beautiful thing. Actually, it's a very powerful set of mathematics. Some people say that you can just replace calculus with it, the study of calculus with it, and you ought to basically dive in there. So it's as calculus is a powerful set of tools, so Fourier transforms are a powerful set of tools. What's up, JP?
Hi guys. Sorry I'm late. I was just getting done doing something here. I totally lost track of time.
I totally get it.
Cool. Yeah, sorry. I don't know if I'll be able to do this today, you guys. I'm exhausted, so I could, I'm hurting, man.
Sounds like you better spend a few minutes with us to say hey and laugh a little, and then go and do something.
All right. Yeah.
Like, yep.
Yeah, I'll hang for a bit.
Okay.
I don't know if I have an hour in me here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we were just talking about finishing up a story about we exchanged what we've been listening to podcasts lately.
Oh, cool.
And I was just mentioning some a neuroscience podcast, or rather a neuroscience topic in Lex Friedman's podcast. The guy named Eagleman, who's written a book called Live Wired. And I just found it another fascinating set of analogies. And we were in the middle of talking about those analogies. I was embellishing on one of them on my own, which is how we were Fourier transforms and calculus when you dropped in. But that was all just chat, and we'll come back to it. I actually have a topic for this evening, which I wanted to hit hard and fast. Let's see. So I'm going to suggest that I take 37 minutes and then we break for the weekend. Something like that. What I wanted to do is an introduction to a shift that I promised we would make, which is toward this 3-lens matrix, a return to that 3-lens matrix. And I wanted to motivate it, and I wanted to point to its future. And so you all watched a couple, at least I'm sure you watched some of each of the last 2 weeks worth of American stories. Remarkably different stories, right, about American life, and pretty mesmerizing actually to take the whole thing in. I found it in some ways, of course, there were moments of inspiration, moments of clarity, also tremendous moments of discouragement at how we get away with that shit. How we get away with what? Putting together such radically different stories that have such, these days, a pretty strong dissonance from somebody else's view of the very same things. It can be a little discouraging when you see the fact that there's such a divide there. And then, of course, building on our conversation on our open topic last time, which I went and retrospectively, cleverly titled "International Affairs and How to Get a Clue," which in a certain way is what we were talking about. But gosh, there's a lot to know there, right? How do we approach all that, et cetera, was what we were talking about last time. And of course, I followed up on that with a couple of pieces, right? 2 from a couple of generals, and 1 from Caitlin Johnston. And Caitlin Johnston weighs in as American narrative number 3. And of course, there's not only 3 of them, right? Or she's not those aren't the big 3 or anything like that. But we did see a powerful pair and a reminder that there are other narratives still, which is pretty, what is it? It's a stark feature of the world we live in. It's pretty remarkable. And it raises the question, how do we move forward in an environment with that many different 3 at least, and no doubt many others, that many different powerful narratives? How do we even start reconciling with one another or collaborating with one another, particularly insofar as they tend to divide, they tend to drift, as they, maybe it's right to say, they seem to be drifting further from one another these days than they used to. That's at least what lots of people seem to say. And then you look at maps of collaboration in Congress and things like that, and you run it back 30 years, and it turns out it used to be that there was more. And now there seems to be less, and there are lots of confirming stories. Whether that is measurably true is another question. What would it be like? And here I want to drop a couple of pictures in. Um, so oftentimes this picture on the left, the spiraling upwards, is used in an education context. It's used for revisiting the same topic more than once, right? As you go up and you add more and more to it. At the same time, we might say we deepen, which is more of a vertical, an inverse vertical metaphor, right? Where you start at the top and move down. I'd like to actually think about it that way for a moment, because I'd like to also see this in the idea of a potential energy well. And a potential energy well is something one settles into and remains there. And that is, in a certain sense, what these pools, these narrative pools, to use a phrase, I'm not really sure what it means. I guess I just made it up, right? But you can sort of fall into these pools, these clusters of like-mindedness, and you seem to stay in them. People tend to, and it's difficult for them to jump from one to the other, or even, yeah. There's a lot to be said there. We've said a lot of it in the past. So, if we take the potential energy analogy, where we're sitting in a sea of information and it's coming at us cacophonously. I love that word. I'm not even sure it's a word. Cacophony is, so cacophonously must be, right? And it's coming at us, just thrown at us in a pile, an unordered, undisciplined, almost unmeaningful pile. And we start to make sense of it and to categorize it and to eventually hang on to little clusters that eventually we might start to dignify with the name of models. So we start to have a little bit of a model, and this is how we process this stuff. This is the way, these are the lenses that we start to craft that help us to recognize patterns as they come through. This is what I take it the brain is doing all the time, from what I know. In fact, it's building models and it's predicting when it's going to see next at a very high rate of speed. But those models, how do they keep the sea of information from pouring in on us and leaving us in utter confusion? And I'm suggesting we need a little bit of a force analogy. We need a pool, a potential energy well that forms, and something's got to keep the sides where they are. Got to keep the whole thing from breaking down, and once again we're on the surface swimming without a paddle, right? At sea, adrift, without much of a clue, without much of a resource, just being buffeted by the waves of information. That we need some analogy to force, and I think we sort of have one, and it's the power that models have for predicting, explaining, controlling. And those are generally, it seems as if there's kind of concepts that come together and do some work for us together. And we can think of the high information flow network of rich communities as one such thing. There's kind of a coherent story to be told about information processing, and that can help us. It's a model for rafting our way through this sea of input. We can say, okay, this is input, and we're processing it, and we're developing various lenses, and we do that in social life in a parallel processing way, and then we exchange information from one perspective to another, hopefully, and we grab ever more power, ever more stability through that process. That's a model, and it helps us sort of navigate the surface of this cacophonous sea of information pouring in on us. So what we'd like to do, I suppose, is figure out a model and actually build and ever deepen these potential energy wells And maybe it's the case that it's the connections between concepts, and concepts are in a certain way a little model all by themselves, as the general is to the specific, right? Think of the 8th grade essay. These are 3 examples, and we develop a thought by way of example, right? And that general claim covers the specifics, and it lets us know that these are kinds of things, right? And so it is a little bit of a classificatory model, and it helps us see a bunch of things under a similar sort of heading, right? And then we start to put some of those general things together. And there's certainly higher order classification, but there's other kinds of processes besides classification. And pretty soon we start to see the world as, right? We see it out of this lens, which is put together by all these various things. And in a certain way, we're drilling down. And here I'm just going to make a suggestion, and it's a suggestion that motivates what we're going to do with our 3-lens matrix. And that is that this process can take place, yes, across layers, but there is powerful layering that goes on in this process. That's apparently true in the brain, in which our neocortical columns apparently have got 6 pretty well-defined layers. And according to people like Jeff Hawkins and others who follow, those 6 layers that are pretty well defined out there in the literature, still being as 6, are interconnected with one another very powerfully, but nonetheless, there is different types of growth, predominance of certain types of cells, different types of functioning, and different algorithmic excuse me a second. Different parts of the algorithm are at work in these different layers. So maybe it's not so crazy if the brain orders it that way. Maybe the suggestion here that there's a kind of layering, and now I'm jumping not into the brain, but unless I happen also to be, but not intentionally jumping into the brain, I'm jumping into the way we think about the world. Just ask us to explain ourselves. That's a psychological level, right? It's the level at which we have intelligent discussion, the level at which we persuade one another, the level at which we're motivated so far as we know, right? When we think about things, we think through things, and we act in various ways. Whatever that whole domain is, it's certainly a conscious domain. There may be other elements that are not conscious in it, but that whole domain, I'm saying, seems to have layering also. Now, I don't know why I think I know that, actually. I've got some guesses, but they're only preliminary, and I'm not going to trot them out here. But one reason I think it is because I think I can see how to do it. And in particular, I think that there are 3 useful layers, each one of which you could say stacks on top if we did a vertical rising learning sort of layer, but we can go down. And I don't necessarily mean down in time or up in time. Maybe it's logical priority, or maybe it's explanatory ease. Or there are many different filters you could use to set an axis here, right? Which one happened first in time is one obvious one. Which one happens in some sort of logical priority where you could not have had this idea until you had these 2, right? Something like that. You couldn't have had an idea of long division before you had the idea of multiplication, probably, right? And maybe that's the case. But you might also have some other kinds of priorities, I think, like explanatory ease is just another one. There may be natural's not what I mean to say. We may just stumble upon easier ways of clustering things and explaining why these things are together and that these things seem to do something for us. It just may be easier, We just happen to fall into it. That may be a function of who we're talking to, even, right? What these orders are of explanatory ease or of rhetorical power. How about that? Right? Where you need more powerful tools in certain kinds of arguments, you can jettison some of the precision that you might need in one kind of argument, and you just grab something that's shallower, easier for practical purposes. That's another kind of ordering. So I do think that there's various kinds of ordering of wholes, and I'm not saying there's only one kind. There may be more than one kind. It just suggested that, I think, but I'm saying that it's useful to think in terms of layers, and then I've constructed a 3-layer matrix on which I want us to do some work. It needs some work, and I want to just sketch what that work looks like. So what I've done so far is motivated a little bit. Let me simply pause because I have them here on these other diagrams that are in front of you. Just 2 things to point out. One, you can get a kind of spiral image from basically from matrix multiplication in some way, from translations from linear algebra. And that's what these particular images, the pair of, there's actually 4 of them, but they're in 2 pair that are related to each other vertically. From this site here where I borrowed them. And I just wanted to suggest that this spiral is a useful tool. Layering might be a useful tool in it. And interaction between spirals might be a useful tool. Imagine, say, 2 W's if you had them, right? Which then you could sort of bring together and drop, which is sort of drawn here, right? It sort of looks like there's a pair of steep wells here that are connected to each other in a way where the slope drops. What I want to suggest, by the way, is that's at some point, that's exactly what we need to do if we're going to address this, call it 3. There's ridiculously many other than 3 stories. But we talked about very different accounts, just to take an example, of America's role in the world, of America's history and America's future and our role in the world. Those are very different, deep potential energy wells that people seem to fall in. And if we're going to collaborate somehow, we're going to have to reduce the potential energy barrier so that people can move from one to the other, at least imaginatively. At least we've got to make that imaginative step lower so it's not impossible. So the last thing you want to do is even admit that somebody might have a point over there, right? Let alone take the time. That is a very high potential energy well, right? You're in your view, and you are very unlikely to grasp their view because they're all freaking idiots, right? Or wicked, or put your favorite word in. That what's required is a relaxing of that potential energy well, which is why I like these drawings. And I just thought I'd point them out before we move on, because I think this is a very powerful analogy, this analogy of spiraling down particularly in what? Spiraling what? In the flow, the onset of information that's pouring in on us. And how is it that we structure something in the first place? What is it even to have a structure? What holds it together? It seems to me we need to understand that. And then we need to build a structure if we are going to bring people together who are in different structures, in different worldviews. If we're going to move forward together, like we say we used to, if we're going to resurrect civility, to use that model, by lowering the activation energy in some way, right? So that we can jump from one perspective to another and see it better. If we're going to do that, we have to face the following problem. It's not as if, well, it is as if in these American stories, these American stories aren't necessarily stories of everything. There may be other things that, although they seem to have a lot of power to impact other things, like like your scientific image of the world. What do we think about? What do we think about the world from a scientific perspective? What do we think we know about it? What's it got to do, right, with our American story? Increasingly, we do see crossover, it seems, right? Because if there are certain parts of the story that don't seem to fit well with our tribe, we might be skeptical about the source. We might begin to favor one account more than another. Some results seem better for us. But when these potential energy wells grow up, as they mature, as they grow into a full-bodied way of looking at the world, I want to suggest everything is in there, not just your American story. Everything gets in there. Everything gets shaped. Not to say that other people don't also have the same things in their very different stories. They do, but they have them in there differently, and they get shaped. They interact with one another. They morph into one another, so it seems, in various ways. So here's the problem. How can you generate a methodology for bringing things together, bringing people together, bringing perspectives together? How can you do that when at least in the extended abstract, right? At least at the limits, each of these things is a whole way of looking at the world. All the resources are in one of these things, and you can't escape it. There's no neutral ground out here to sit and say, what am I going to do about these three ways over there of looking at the world? As if I don't need a way of looking at the world, or don't have a way of looking at the world, or aren't in myself some additional big vortex, right? Or big shelter in the storm, or what of cacophony of information, or whatever metaphor we choose to use. I'm in a potential energy well too. And it doesn't seem like you can, what would it be to step out of a potential energy well on this model? It's to step up into resourcelessness. That's what it's like to be on the surface up here. That's why we started digging these things in the first place, because we're overwhelmed with information and we need models to hang on to and to process it all. So not to be in one of these things is to have no processing resources. How can we look there for solutions to our problem? Our deep division and our increasing separation. How do we resurrect civility when there's no neutral ground? That's the epistemological question. That's a tough question. I think the answer is you don't. We've sort of seen this line before. It keeps coming up. You've got to do it from within a system, and somehow you're going to have to find a way to tunnel. From within a system, you're going to have to find a way to tunnel into another, to come to understand it, to come to take it seriously, to come to be admitted, because it's hard to understand it if nobody will talk to you. If all you do is watch and you can't exchange, so somehow you have to be let in. All of that can begin to whittle down that activation energy that separates these groups. But you have to bring resources with you in, and those resources are going to, in a certain way, be mining tools. They're going to be tools that cut into, cut across, cut through. Who knows exactly what the right metaphor is? Here I have in mind, there literally is quantum tunneling as a thing, right? In which there is a potential energy barrier, literally, as would be the case. Look in this picture in the upper right, and there is a potential energy barrier there. If you understand this is a potential energy space here, then you've got to get up from here. You got to climb this in order to get down. That's a potential energy barrier from one to the other. And that's what quantum tunneling does, is not go over the barrier. It does not provide enough energy to a particle to go over the top. It simply changes the equation, and now the particle's on the other side. That's quantum tunneling. It's as if it went through. It's like, no, it didn't go over the brick wall. It's just on the other side of the brick wall now. It did not go over. The brick wall goes all the way up, and you're enclosed in a room. There is no way over, maybe, right, in some particular physical situation, and yet a particle got through anyway. What the heck is up with that? That's quantum tunneling. So it's not crazy then to imagine that in some ways we're looking for resources like that, right? You call them mining tools at one level, call them ascending and descending tools at another level, right? Call them quantum tunneling analogs if you could figure out how to do it. None of those possibilities are laid out for no reason. They're not laid out randomly. They're laid out because I think we're going into all those spaces. Okay. So we're going to be done in 11 minutes.
Yeah, that was interesting. Out of all your analogies, I liked the sea of information the best, where you're on the top, and that would make all of these spirals whirlpools, basically, which seems like you wouldn't want to fall into a whirlpool in general. Right. But also, if you move two whirlpools close together, then maybe they start to get the same information spilling into both of them. So I think that's another way for like people to share ideas, is start to try and get them the same information. Because I think that's kind of why people have also been drifting so far apart, is because there is no sharing of information anymore. So.
Yeah, you mean just physically we don't even try sometimes. There's just no one's seeing this, no one's talking about this, etc.
Yeah.
There is a lot of that. There's also a lot of the following. A lot of people saw the convention, saw the whole night of Trump's speech in front of the White House last night. Let's take an example, right? And yes, there could be interviews that weren't had in one network rather than another, right? In one group of people rather than another, but they might have seen the same thing in one sense and yet still taken different information from it. They may just really process it differently.
Yeah, I think certainly, but I think most of the time we get our information processed for us before we actually get any, like the actual information. It gets processed through hosts and the media and podcasts or everything, because it's hard to figure out for ourselves. So if like unfiltered information actually started to get through to both groups in the same way, I think could be interesting or beneficial at the very least.
Yeah, I get your point. Let's keep coming back to that point over and over again. I want to know if there's such a thing as unfiltered information. At the moment, I'm not inclined to suspect there is.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I recognize a lot of what you're saying. It's not like I don't know how to make the case for unfiltered information being a thing. I think I do know how to make the case, but I also know how to make the case for it not being a thing. And then I need an account for bringing these different perspectives together, right? And that's what I don't know how to do well enough. So that's why I say I think we need to keep coming back to that. Okay. Let's see. Let me just point to two things and then we'll be done. First thing I want to point to, I'm going to do by way of just returning to this off-visited master spreadsheet here. And I just wanted to point out that there is somewhere in here a 3 lens matrix, and here it is. And so a task here is to say what the 3 lenses are, number one, and what are the various pieces whose interconnectedness, interrelatedness at each level provides the structure to keep the whole of the information cacophony from falling in on us. I do think, by the way, when it does fall in on us and we live at the surface, we are living in a very high entropy environment. It's an incredible state of disorder. It's something like everything's the same and we don't know what to say about anything, right? It's just we are resourceless experiencers with no ability to sort through, predict, take control of, give an account of what happened, make a prediction of what's going to happen in the future. It's just shit happens, one thing after another, right? And we don't know what to say about it. I'm not sure how seriously I mean to take this metaphor. I do think that there are people whose lives seem a lot like that. They really don't know what to say about hardly anything, right? Or they may have a conviction or two, but it may be unconnected by them in any coherent way with anything else, and they don't know how to bring those things together that they think, and they don't try. And I'm suggesting that's a person who's adrift with maybe a piece of driftwood that comes by every now and then to keep their head out of the sea, but they don't have much of a raft. They're not building much of a structure. They're not bringing together a kind of order and using that order, that internal order, to impose some kind of order on the world around them. And they are at a fairly high entropy state, and literally they're not tunneling down into this potential. Well, this, I suppose, now is an increasing dysentropy well. This is a negative entropy well. So what is it that's holding these pieces together? We've got to map that, I want to say. You've got to have a lens. You've got to be able to say what the lens is. Like Aristotle says, it's the plot, stupid, that holds the whole tragedy together. You ought to be able to say what the plot is. It ought to be short and sweet, and everything else follows from it. Everything else is built on it, but the plot itself generates excitement, he says in the Poetics. It generates engagement. It's the thing that matters. If you don't have that right, you don't have anything else. You don't have a well-structured whole. So we have to figure out what are the framework there, what are the key pieces, and how do they interact with one another? How do they hold together? What work do they do? That's what a map looks like of this spiraled environment. What is it to take a ring around the spiral? Jumping, I'm hoping, once again, back to the spiral. What we've got to do is put some dots on it in a certain way and say these various dots are tools. They're conceptual tools. And when you put a few of them in proximity to one another, such that you can tell a little bit of a story with all of them, you get a layer. You get a powerful layer that's doing some work for you. And then, so what is that layer? I'm going to suggest that first one is the high information flow network of rich communities. I think that's a very natural, easy layer to build. It's not super easy, but I think it's easy enough to build. And then I think there's another layer that comes underneath it. And I think that other layer is a conscious realism layer. And that's a very different type of tool, very different layer. And I think there's a third layer under that. And that layer is fundamentally a layer of personal love. It's a layer that this whole sea of conscious experience is fundamentally conscious, loving interaction. That this is an information-based natural theology. And then at the very deepest core of that natural theology is where Christian revelation fits in. That's a story that needs to be told, and then I want 3 more minutes and we're done. All I want to do now is jump to one more share. It looks like a very different toy. This is a learning tool to do physics with data from particle physics, in particular from the compact muon solenoid, the CMS detector at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. There is a path through this space. Think of this as a turn around the spiral ring, or maybe a second turn, in a very particular area. We're not investigating everything, but we're investigating a lot. And there is here, under this figure it out rubric, this is technically called a milestone map, where you say, if you get this far and you can do this, you got this thing. And then you could go on to a next thing and add that next thing on there. And then there are a number of next things, but they're not infinite. And when you're done, you've figured it out. In particular, in this case, you have a plot that means something, that was a result of an inquiry into a whole cacophony of particle physics information. And you've employed a certain set of models that integrate together and that are expressed, the meaningful interaction amongst these different pieces is expressed in a scientific product, namely a plot with meaning, and then you go on to tell other people about it, which is the rest of the scientific process. And all I want to do is show you on this map. Sorry, I wanted to be in the getting started mode here, not in the figure it out. These are the tools you use in order to you demonstrate the power of these tools with the data over here, which produces a precise plot, which then can be shared with other people. That's the movement of thought through here. And all I wanted to do is show you one little writing assignment. I actually did this writing assignment. I had to figure out, how do you weave your way through the space? What are the contours of the learning curve? We talk about climbing the learning curve in a given area. What are the main handholds here, right? Where is it slippery and where is it not slippery? Where do you get to when you hang on and you have a little bit of stability, right? As you climb or as you spiral, if that climb is in a spiral. And here are answers to those questions, but they have to be answers that are written tiny so that you already know something about what they mean, or at least are reminded about the whole that that thing means by the tiny little bumper sticker, or what's the phrase they use? I'm forgetting it. A tagline in marketing, right? A tiny little tagline. One is, and just follow this through and it makes a certain sense. Here's all you have to do to know what the hell you're doing. Okay? You got to know, what are the big questions that are being asked by all these scientists anyway? What the heck are they all doing here? Right? Then you got to know your detector. Again, tiny little phrases. Just know your detector. What are all these pieces? What's the instrument that they're doing it with? They're after all these big questions. What are they looking at it with? With this. Turns out there's some major parts in that thing, and that gets unfolded. But that's this piece. What is it that's the input to this device? Review your particle types. You've got to know what kinds of things are coming in, how long those things last, how they penetrate the detector or they don't, how they interact with the detector. You've got to review your particle types. With all that, you're in a position to interpret data. Now you can see a single pathway of particles through the detector, and now that has some meaning for you. You didn't produce that. It's not yet a plot that you produced, but it is a story that you can tell of a particle moving through a detector, and it makes sense. And then you've got to understand a little bit of physics. You've got to, in particular, apply some conservation laws: conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, conservation of charge. And those things are written into what's happening in this little space. And then finally you come out of there and you say, I think I get it. I can now ask a question. I now know what to ask. Why? Because you've got a model. You've got a model of physics. You've got a model of the detector. You've got a model of particle interactions in the detector. You've got a model of the way we manifest how particles interact in the detector. It turns out these data are both for single events and for compiling events in histograms across time. You need to interpret all of that. So you got to apply a little bit of mathematics, and then you have to see that there are some tools we've used to understand the world that fit in here. And they're not much. What a milestone does, let me pull up only one. What a login as guest, thank you. What a milestone, oops, well, I'll skip this for now. I don't know why that happened. It could be, I used to be in charge of making sure that didn't happen. So that's many years ago. So I don't know why it happened. I wasn't in charge of fixing it, mind you, just figuring out who we should ask. What this basically says is it'll give you a task. It'll give you a tiny little task. It'll say something like, in the case of Know Your Detector, describe the major parts of the detector, of the CMS detector. That's it. And when you're done and you say, okay, I can say something about the major parts. I start on the inside and work my way out, right? And when you think you're done, you are done. That's enough of a pass at a certain resolution. Does that make sense? You could spend all day on here. You could describe it ad infinitum, ad nauseum. We're not asking you to do that. We're asking you of just a little bit, like write a paragraph at a paragraph length, and the shortest length you can give me, say something that's true about the various parts of the detector. That's all I mean by Know Your Detector. Okay. The last thing I want to say, drop this now. It's not even worth dropping it. Just leave it here and we're going to close. What I want to say is this is our task for the 3-lens matrix. What I've done is taken almost a brainstorm dive all the way through a whole bunch of questions, a bunch of problems, a bunch of resources for those problems, a tiny little postage stamp of a sketch of a solution, all in one place. That has got to be translated into really a resource map where the resources come together and enable you to do something at each of these levels. So you've got to be able to spit out solutions from this conglomeration of resources, and only this set of resources, establishing some interconnectedness and interdependencies of solutions on multiple resources at this layer. And then pulling together, in the end, one useful pass, one useful visit. It's not around everything, so the spiral breaks down. It's not like the spiral goes everywhere or sees everything. That couldn't be right. But you're making the rounds in some sense. You're covering a lot of ground every time you put one of these layers together. And there ought to be a lot of bang for your buck. For your resources ought to be shown to be fruitful in order for there to be a bit of a layer. And now you're seeing the force against the cacophony. These are reinforcing rods, these relationships. They hold the cacophony at bay. They enable you to say, I don't have to be lost here. I have something to say here. Right? I can explain what happened. I can predict what's going to happen. In some cases, I can control what's going to happen. And so I've got some power, and that power is the force that holds the potential energy well together. It is an order. It's a highly ordered connection, and it's fascinating when you think about it. It is a dive down a negative entropy well. We've basically grabbed order from disorder, and we've hung on to it and sewn it together and built a structure. And we have to keep doing that, and I'm pretty sure at 3 useful layers. I've already said at each one of these levels, you get transformed as a viewer. You get transformed at each of these levels, and you can't necessarily just do it all at once. You can't grab all 37 pieces and come up with a coherent account. You have to grab enough so that it's small enough to get your hands around, big enough to show some power, and hold on to it long enough to be transformed yourself by the insight and the benefit that's generated at each stage. And then it's in light of the experience you have at that stage where you say, this kind of makes sense. There's something right here. I want to hang on to this. Where does this go? That's the energy that drills you down to the next level. I think that pedagogically, I think that's how it goes. So thanks. You just listened to me for a long 45 minutes and 10 minutes over. JP, I see smoke coming out your ears, and sorry, man.
Yeah, that's me. Smoke coming out the ears. Yeah.
We should quit. It's Friday, and let's go have some fun. I'm gonna go make some drinks. Gin and tonics, I think, are in order.
Well, you deserve it, Uncle Tom. That was super interesting.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thanks. You guys are a great incentive. I got done with my physics lab this afternoon and walked home and thought about this as hard as I could in my actual half an hour that I could really dedicate. It's not that I spent no time. I'd put that slide together earlier, et cetera, knowing we were coming here. But yeah, I'd say this interaction together is actually bearing a lot of fruit for me, at least. It's helping me drill down just a little bit further, right? It's an occasion for trying to put some of this stuff into a little bit more coherent shape. So thanks.
All right.
Awesome.
Another time we'll do Q&A. Maybe we'll revisit this again we'll start again on Monday. I'll send Rachel a link. I think we've recorded it.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
All right.
See you guys later.
Okay.
Thanks.
Have a good
Appreciate your time.